Thank you very much for being here and choosing this Festival of Idea event. And my name is Laura Marco, and I work as a researcher at the Department of Media. And I know for those of you who might be guests at campus, I will just mention that this event is organized by the Institute for Creative Enterprise, which is one of EdgeHill's 3 research institutes. And it aims to connect our interdisciplinary research with the cultural institutions in local, national, international contexts. So in this sense, I should also mention the thriving partnership between EdgeHill and Tate Liverpool that has fostered the realization of some of its most successful exhibitions, as Leonora Carrington, Transgressing Discipline in 2015, Dave Klein exhibition in 2017, involving a Tate Exchange collaboration with our animation program, and most recently the Op Art in Focus.
Precisely.
Yeah. And I think that it's particularly interesting and relevant for us to discuss the art of Keith Haring, specifically in the context of this year's Festival of Ideas, since the topic is exchanges. And as we know, Keith Haring's creative practice has been marked by multiple collaborations with fellow artists like Andy Warhol, Jean-Michel, Basquiat, Yoko Ono, Kenny Sharp, or celebrity figures as Madonna and Grace Jones. And probably what's even more significant for understanding his work is his constant attempt to reach the public and to involve the audience in his work by using urban spaces and streets and the subways, as we're going to discuss further, using the street as a ready-made gallery in itself, a studio. So we're once again pleased to welcome Darren Pih, who curated the exhibition at Tate, and his impressive career as a curator involves multiple exhibitions, including transmitting Warhol in 2015.
Around then. Yves Klein.
Yves Klein also. You have also created the Turner Prize.
I did the first Turner
7,
Prize
and in the topic of pop art, Glam, the performance of style.
The Glam Rock Show.
And Darren has published multiple essays and in exhibition catalogs and online. And I think I will start drawing directly upon my personal experience from the opening of the exhibition, which was extremely impressive and somehow reenacting the New York's art scene almost in Liverpool. So what makes Keith Haring so relevant and contemporary today in terms of visual language and also social activism? And why this exhibition in Liverpool?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. I mean, I think it was it's the first major UK show of Keith Haring, which is surprising to me, because I think we know Keith Haring's the imagery, these modern hieroglyphs. He's an artist whose imagery and his ideas, his activism in some ways has sort of entered the popular imagination. So we sort of know the artist, or we think we know the artist, this 80s artist who sort of emerged as part of this sort of downtown art scene. But he hadn't had a big UK show, so it's a real coup, I think, to have the show in Liverpool, the first major show. It's been a big success in terms of audience. Response numbers, critical response has been very good. It's touring internationally as well, so it's been a good show. I think Keith Haring is an artist. I'm an exhibitions curator, so I've become a short-term expert on whatever show. I spent 3 years studying his life, reading his journals, studying his exhibitions, his writings, his work, meeting people meeting collectors and people who knew him. And I think the reason why Keith Haring still has a presence, and is because he was working as a visual activist, I think, in the 80s. He was creating these sort of symbols that communicated very instantaneously in the moment. They were sort of almost like sign painting, but they were responding to social issues which are still present now. So things like HIV activism, AIDS activism, homophobia, racism, the Cold War, this accumulation of nuclear warheads, this kind of face-off between East and West in the 1980s, the Soviets and the Americans, still seem to be in the air now. So I think there's something about Haring being somebody who was a sort of he sort of said at the time that he saw himself as a spokesperson for his generation. I think if we're interested in the way in which an artist isn't confined to the studio and isn't making work that is just, you know, made for an exclusive art audience, and can be, that's okay. But I think if we're interested in the public role of art and the public role of artists to somehow be, you know, 1 foot on the street, 1 foot in the gallery, drawing on art ideas, which is why he's interested in Tate. I think you can see he can see in the first part of the show, it's clearly it's a sort of juvenilia sort of section, but you can see he's looking at mid-century abstraction and Art Brut and Jean de Buffet and Pierre Alechinsky, and there's a bit of Jackson Pollock in the throwing the making these immersive abstract painted environments when he's a student in Pittsburgh in 1978. That's where the show starts. So it's coming from an arty idea and semiotics and linguistics and pop art too, of course, and then it becomes fused with activism in the 1980s, and that's so he's sort of, I mean, I think as the 80s progressed, I'd say he's somebody who was you know, he sort of lands in East Village, New York City, 1978, immerses himself in the counterculture. You can see that, you know, organising exhibitions in nightclubs, clearly hedonistic. It's a subcultural scene, and then it becomes popular culture by about 82, 83. But all the way through, he's collaborating right from the beginning. He's collaborating with street artists like LA2, Basquiat, Kenny Scharf. You know, he's making films with Kenny Scharf that are shown in the Times Square show. So he's sort of he's not sort of he's a very public, very collaborative, very socially conscious artist, I think, and that's why I think he's interesting now. So. Yeah,
I was very much impressed by your curatorial approach and being able to immerse the audience in such an enigmatic personality.
Yeah.
And if you could share more, because indeed it was specifically the opening. It had a sensation of New York's underground scene. Yeah, it was like a party with DJs and all the elements, media elements you've included with the video screenings and the hip hop soundtrack.
I think it was important. I mean, I saw a few shows. I saw some Keith Haring shows in the run up to when I was preparing for the show in Liverpool. And the thing about Keith Haring's work is that they're very, they're apparently simple. I think there's something about they're made in a very performative way. Sort of draws. There's no preparatory sketching. They're made very spontaneously, impulsively. Those subway drawings that you saw in the first part of the room, where he's making these tens of thousands of these drawings on the New York subway, and he made, and I think he was just carrying chalk around continually for 5 years, and every time we saw a blacked out panel. You see them in the presentation, but essentially, when he landed in New York City in 1978, he is quickly impressed by street art, and he sees on the streets, on the trains, and he sort of really associates that very unhesitant, free-flowing, spray-painted line that he enjoys with abstract. He's like Jackson Pollock. I think he sees that sort of very fluid line where it's the same sort of rawness, same like energy, same like immediacy, and it communicates that sort of hyper-stylized graphics that he sees, these big tags, which are anonymous, they're marginal, but it's communicating something in a very powerful, confident way. So I think the subway drawings that he makes from 1980, which really would have, really raised his profile. If you were in New York in the early 80s, you would have seen these on the subway all the time. You would have seen him making them. So I think he was. I think we wanted to bring something of that, the energy of into the show. I mean, I think his work, it's not static. These canvas paintings, their works, they come from the street. I think his use of tarpaulin rather than canvas. Yeah. It's an industrial street material. It's the kind of thing you saw. He sees on the street. He's making works on hoardings. He's making street murals, on the wall. So it's ephemeral. It's very public. And I really felt when you're curating a show, I really like it when you bring the time, the context, the video, the sound, the energy, you know, corrugated metal, in a very subtle way, hopefully, but trying to drop you into the time. So I wanted it to really feel as soon as you walk in, as you see in the show. There's a film which is called Painting Myself Into the Corner, which is Haring in his studio in 1978 at the School of Visual Arts. And he sort of he begins, you know, he's basically, you know, the thing is he's filming himself, so he's very comfortable making work, you know, filming himself making a work, and he sort of begins by sort of drawing a black outline on which covers the entire floor of his studio, and then he begins to sort of fill it in. So you can see it's almost like performance painting. You know, it's like there's no hesitation. He's just drawing, and there's no. It's a complete one line,
pretty mediated,
completely fluid, and then it's finished, and then that's it. And actually, I'm sure that drawing no longer exists. You know, so it's ephemeral. So there's something about the performance of making the work on the subway, on the, you know, street murals, and also filming himself. I think writing the body of the artist into the meaning of the work in some way, I think.
And talking about the simplicity of his line and the directness of his messages, you already mentioned that he was inspired by semiotics.
Yeah.
Could you take us through his own specific visual language? And what are these kind of very known symbols, like the radiant baby, the barking dog? What do they signify for?
I think he would say that they don't signify, they don't have meaning. I think that's what he. I think it's what he would say. But I think I mean he grew up with cartoon. I mean, I think the account of Keith Haring is that he grew up with a love of cartooning. He grew up in a town called Kutztown in Pennsylvania, very culturally conservative, cherry pie upbringing, but drawing cartoons, encouraged to draw cartoons by his father. So there's something very like innocent and unprejudiced. It's just, you know, it's kind of child drawing. So I think drawing and a love of drawing, and that sort of you know, it's sort of related to pop art and Liechtenstein, but I think it's also it's Walt Disney. It's, you know, I think so. That's the beginning, and then he goes to New York City in 1978 and becomes a student at the School of Visual Arts, and he's being taught by people like Bill Beckley, who's a conceptual artist interested in semiotics. He was taught by Simone Forti, who's a sort of a performance artist. Keith Saunier is on the faculty, so he's being exposed very quickly to performance art, linguistic theory, this idea of language having. I mean, I'm not a semiotician, but I think he's interested in the idea of language. The meaning of something changes depending on the context and reception on some level. So the cut up, he begins making cut up collages with newspaper headlines. So it's like a William Burroughs, and then he puts these cut up collages onto the streets. At the same time, people like Jenny Holzer was doing the same thing. So he's interested in semiotics and this idea of language having a dynamic force, and the meaning is construed in the moment of reception, depending on the context. And so I think it's as if just before he begins to return to drawing in the summer of 1980, he begins making these cartoons, these what we now think of as Keith Haring, these sort of modern hieroglyph drawings with radiant babies and barking dogs and flying saucers and robots. It's like, but it's a very specific visual language, and they all happen. There's no. It's as if it's like semiotics. If you think of them as being like the free-floating signs or symbols,
he's quite indexical,
and it's open meanings, and the meaning is completed by looking at the work. So I think, looking at now, I think Keith Haring's work and his life seems to be symptomatic of the 80s, because it seems to be he's like a sponge, and he's sort of drawn on. I mean, things like the barking dog, and Baby are they're sort of tags. It's a tag culture. That was his signature, Radiant Baby. There's also things like pyramids and Copticus. So he's clearly drawing on ancient, so-called primitive art forms. I mean, I think it's sort of there's a sort of appropriation of ancient art and hieroglyphs and urns and flying saucers and robots. So it's video gaming. So it seems to be just this open absorption of different symbols that were in the air in the 1980s, which is why it's sort of now it seems to be. If you look at Keith Haring, it's just really from the 80s. I think it looks, the palette and the symbols and the hip hop culture. It's. Yeah. That's why I think it was important not to be trapped by the nostalgia of the time, because of the 80s I was there. So I think it was clearly there was. I mean, what was very exciting about the exhibition opening was that a lot of people who came to the opening were clearly they were born after 1990. So they were. It was still that was very reassuring. It wasn't just old ravers who were interested. Yeah,
and it was such a celebration for the city. You could walk around and identify who is going to Tate, basically.
Mixed generations too. Yeah.
And while he's so famous for his stylized visual motifs, what was very interesting in the exhibition that you also touched upon his experiments with performance and video art. As you mentioned, has his work been reinterpreted in popular culture later? Has his visual motifs been reinterpreted in popular culture or
reinterpreted until
but by other artists? I'm not sure if.
I think
not directly.
I think. I think the visual language is so simple. I think it's difficult to. I think his effect. I think he's an artist who's. I think the most profound legacy of Keith Haring is as an activist. I think any artist now, like Tanya Bruguera, anybody who is making work in response to urgent social and political issues, I think is linked to Keith Haring. I think Keith Haring was. It's funny because his work doesn't really. He was interesting at the time because in the early 80s he was exhibiting in things like the Times Square show, New York New Wave at PS1. So he was interested. He was being included in interesting group shows with Kiki Smith and Kenny Sharp and Basquiat and Jenny Holtz and David Hammonds and people. But I think as he became famous, and maybe there was it was Reaganomics and market hype where Haring and Basquiat and people like Julian Schnabel were being sort of lifted by the art market. I think Haring was. I think his reputation suffered because he was things like the Pop Shop, and becoming.
In 86 or
86, yeah. I think essentially, he was making these chalk subway drawings, which I really think are sort of key because he didn't sign them. They were made in a very. They were made publicly. In public space. They weren't designed to enter the art market and be sort of commodified. They were just made in a very open-handed, generous way. I'm going to put my work, my drawings, in the most public space possible, the New York subway, where they would be seen by ordinary people. So I think the Pop Shop, because by 83, 84 he was being exhibited internationally and collected, people were beginning to take the chalk subway drawing. They were just breaking, they were coming down to the subway at 1 o'clock in the morning, dead of night, disguised as train guard staff, and they were just breaking them off the wall. So I think they were just. I think I don't think Haring really enjoyed that. I don't think he liked this idea that they weren't there to be taken. So he stopped making them in 85 actually, and then the Pop Shop opened in 86. But I think his. I think that fame and collaborating with Grace Jones and Madonna and being on MTV, in effect, because it wasn't seen as being critical, it wasn't. It was complicit with the market in some brazen way. It affected his reputation. But I think now, in retrospect, if we're interested in an artist who just wishes to communicate a message as broadly as possible through multiple platforms, so not limited to presenting ideas in art galleries, so, but also through T-shirts and posters and pin badges, and to communicate something urgent, crack is whack, anti-apartheid messages. He's a very prescient artist, I think. It's sort of like linking activism to, like combining Warhol and dispersing ideas publicly and activism in the 1980s.
So in this sense, the pop shop that was selling his T-shirts and buttons and so on could be seen as an attempt to make his art more accessible to the public, not so much as a commercial project. There's always somehow an ongoing discussion.
I don't know how successful commercial. I mean, I don't know how commercial how successful it was. I mean, I think it lasted a few years. I think he opened a pop shop in Tokyo in '88 as well, which lasted 6 months because there were so many fake Keith Harings. I mean, it was easy, so the sort of fake. The fake Keith Haring stopped him from making money, so it didn't last that long. So I think the pop shop in Tokyo closed in 2005. I mean, I think Keith Haring was he was charitable, like in his time. He was an activist. He was and I think things like HIV activism and AIDS activism. I think it's key that he established in 1980. He was diagnosed in 1988 HIV positive, and then in '89 he founded the Keith Haring Foundation, which still exists now. And essentially, it's they generate like income through through merchandise, but they redistribute the income to charity. I think it's non-profit, but the money that they make through the Keith Haring the Keith Haring socks and whatnot, is redistributed to AIDS charities, HIV charities, children's charities. So there's a philanthropic aspect, I think, to Keith Haring. So that reflected the way in which he worked in his lifetime.
Yeah, that's great that you reveal this aspect of his works,
Yeah.
specifically a focus on activism and involving community groups.
Yes,
because he's usually known as a celebrity figure.
Yes, yeah. And he was doing them side by side. I think he was using his platform to raise awareness of different issues.
What are specific probably projects working with children or?
Yeah. Well, I think you can see the. He was making public murals. I mean, they don't really exist now, but a lot of the murals he was making in New York City and Chicago and Pennsylvania, he was working with young people. So they were often with social messages like crack is whack, this kind of drugs epidemic that swept through America in the mid-1980s. Things like the apartheid movement as well. So there's a large anti-apartheid work loaned from the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. So he was lending his voice to the urgent political issues of the of the 80s. The Cold War, accumulation of nuclear warheads. There's in the show you'll see there's a poster he made in '82, which is really which he made from his own pocket. He sort of made it. He printed it himself. 20,000 were printed, and then he would hand them out at what remains one of the largest anti-nuclear rallies in American history. So he was at the time when he was becoming known and being collected and exhibiting internationally. He was still politically active, I think, and that's why I think his interest. I think in the age of social media that you can mobilize youth movements behind simple ideas, simple symbols, or a simple cause. And I think Haring was doing the same thing in a very visual way, using his drawings.
Probably if he were alive, he would employ social media.
I would think so.
Yeah. I recall that he painted the Berlin Wall 3 years. Maybe it's
86, I think. Yeah.
86.
Yeah.
Just remember when the Brexit vote, the Leave vote came through, and some political analyst, I think Ivan Krestev, mentioned that it will have the historical significance of German reunification, but in reverse.
Yeah.
So what was behind Keith Haring's creative intent?
I think it was like Eastern West. I mean, if you look at the drawing, of course, the wall's not there now. But I think he was. I mean, I think there was a sort of a fundamental unprejudiceness. I think so. He was combining the colours of the two of the East German flag and the West German flag in this sort of like arm, these hands reaching together to create this reaching out beyond the wall. So I think it was an age of, you know, there's an idealism in Keith Haring, you know, sort of wanting to find ways to bridge peoples. I mean, I think he was doing the same thing in the 80s. So, I mean, things like in the early 80s when he was organising exhibitions of bringing street artists from the South Bronx and the Harlem to downtown New York, really combining uptown New York with downtown New York. That sort of like bringing together different tribes and peoples that were sort of multi-ethnic and across different sort of class lines. So he was a sort of a unifier. I think he saw art as being, you know, in some fundamental way, it was a way to bring people together, I think, and the Berlin Wall, I think, was one example of that. So I don't think we can claim Keith Haring led to the end of the Cold War. But I think there was clearly, he was part of a movement where these ideas were in the air, I think.
Yeah, my impression is that the 80s artists were quite optimistic and somehow believing that art would solve the world.
Exactly.
I always thought, when talking about street art, although he didn't define himself as a street artist,
No, I
think of Deep Hebdu's renowned book, Subculture and the Meaning of Style from '79, where he talks about graffiti, or as he calls it, this wild style of graffiti as a form of symbolic resistance. Following Deep Hebdu's argument that any avant-garde sooner or later becomes a mainstream, I'm just questioning, is street art still somehow subversive, transgressive,
Precisely.
has a transformative potential today?
It's an expression. I mean, I think lots of artists have been. I mean, it would have been graffiti would have been in New York City, you know, from the beginning of the 70s. An artist like Gordon Matta Clark was, you know, he was interested in this sort of expression at the margins, something that was like in between things. That was you know, it had a spirit of underground resistance, and it was clandestine and subversive and anonymous, which gave it the sort of power, I think. So I think Haring, I think he, you know, I don't think he didn't claim to be a street artist. I think he was just very, very like a sponge. He was very like open to whatever influences he saw, and I think he writes in his journals being really quickly impressed by the street art, the wild style graffiti that he sees on the streets of New York City, and it becomes, he takes it, he begins to use it in his own, but he also collaborates with street artists. You know.
And what about the local context here and probably Liverpool street art culture? You have worked on this project of the Liverpool and the avant-garde and the Liverpool, the creative universe. It's just my personal impression that sometimes when I'm moving around the Baltic Triangle and I question, do the murals and the graffiti have some kind of political subtext, or is it just a decorative function?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But I mean, I think Haring wasn't a street artist. I really think he was. He was inspired by street art, and I think it gives it like sort of a street energy. I think it gives it a sort of. I think it was. It's interesting. I think he's an artist who was using the street as a platform for expression. And I don't think that isn't strictly street art. I mean, graffiti is, you know, it's an activity. You know, many people have been associating Haring with people like Banksy, and I don't think that's quite the same, because I think Banksy, we don't know, he's anonymous, and we don't know who he is, and it's something. He's clearly he's courting a media profile through anonymity. But I think Haring was something different because he was completely public. You know, he was on the street. He was being filmed. You know, he was being filmed being like arrested. So, I mean, I don't think it was clearly slightly staged. I think, but I think he was a very public artist in a way that Banksy's not. I don't think.
Yeah, in the context of our team exchanges, maybe if you could. Say something for the multiple collaborations we had in staging and developing the show. I believe it's quite a huge project, and probably it's traveling into Brussels and Essen.
Essen, yeah. So what in terms of the collaborations?
The collaboration or the exchanges, or even with local communities here, or different activities that are supporting the exhibition.
Well, I think it's. I mean, I think we've got the key collaborations. I mean, we've got. It's a difficult question, that I think, in terms of. I mean, in terms of, is it how Keith Haring collaborated himself, or how Tate collaborated?
Tate rather.
Tate. Well, I mean, it's been a great show. I mean, it took. I was working on the show for 3 years, which is. It's really great to be able to, because I think you can make it enables you to develop good partnerships and good collaborations, and secure all the loans. So we have a conference that we're going to be organising with John Moores University at McLaren. That's supported by the Keith Haring Foundation, which is the major sort of lender and sponsor of the exhibition. But in general, I think the public programme has been very open-ended, in the sense that Keith Haring's an artist that enables you to speak to different audiences, to the LGBTQ community. So we had a sort of a late Tate during the Pride weekend. So that was a really big party and a big success. But also you can talk to different design audiences, to art audiences. I was really pleased that it was reviewed not just in the mainstream press, but also in the London Review of Books and the Burlington. So it's really interesting how an artist who is apparently simple, and has this, if it was just simply graphics that were just sort of from the 80s, which on some level they are on the surface, but they also, it's like a ruined stone to the 80s, and you can open up different relationships to semiotics and activism, LGBTQ, homophobia, all these different like audiences that you can communicate with. And I think that's generated really good partnerships, and the media partnership was also really powerful. So no, it's been a good show, I think.
Yeah, great show. Yeah. If you haven't seen it, you have the chance to do it till 10th of November. And probably we can also open the floor for questions from the audience.
No questions. Oh God, you got two. Okay.
So with Andy Warhol, it was really hard for collectors later to identify like the quality of the original work, which print is the first. What was the situation, with Keith Haring? Like, are all his works original, and are for collectors only originals valuable, or did he make prints?
He made prints as well. Yeah, I think it's Keith Haring is actually quite a tricky, is quite an interesting artist. I think that's quite interesting because initially he wasn't making works for the market, for things like the chalk subway drawings. So I think there's the question of authenticity with Keith Haring is it's difficult to. I mean, I think the other works in the show, of course, are authentic works. I think because I think for a long time. The Keith Haring Foundation, which acts as the estate, that's the foundation that he established in '89 to manage his reputation and his work, to hold his archives, his intellectual rights. But they were authenticating works. And Keith Haring was an artist who was it must have been quite a tricky time actually, because I think when he was exhibiting internationally after '83, he had his first show abroad in '82 in Rotterdam, and in '83 he goes to London, Tokyo, Paris. He never used to he didn't transport drawings for exhibition. He'd always just get onto a plane and turn up and make the show in situ. So he wasn't somebody he wasn't a conventional artist. He wasn't like transporting works. He would just rack up, source the materials, make the show. So the Matrix, the big frieze drawing in the show, was made in Connecticut, and he just turned up at the kind of gallery. Probably made it in 24 hours in one go, listening to hip hop music. Complete. So, but he was always drawing. I think that's something. He was making a lot of drawings in situ, just like Keith. Can you sign this? Can you do me a drawing, Keith? So I think it must have been very difficult for the expectation to authenticate work, so they stopped that actually. But no, he produced edition prints for the pop shop and also for the galleries as well, which are all, and generally prints are made in an edition of 50 or 75. Or so, but the works are. What's the question? How do we know what is unauthentic? Keith Haring.
No, I was just thinking about like how Andy Warhol, for instance,
Yeah.
tried to make his art really popular.
Yeah, yeah.
How it was the conception of pop art. How
Yeah.
it was a factory, his studio.
Yeah,
And how Haring acted in relation to that.
Yeah.
Did he try to make his art like all around? Did he make a lot of prints to distribute?
yeah, he did.
And to make profit?
He did. He began to work in a dispersed way. I think that's what I was saying. I think after he met Andy Warhol in '83, really at the point at which his career was really taking off, and he could see his work was becoming more exclusive. The drawings and the tarpaulin works were becoming less affordable to ordinary people. So I think, the influence of pop art and this idea that his drawing and his very distinct, very sure, sharpie line, and his palette is very, very simple, and the visual language is very distinctive. It's blank. It's all the same. Or this particular, this Haring line and the symbols, it could be cloned. It could be cloned and replicated, and this could be turned into a T-shirt or a printed poster, which could be an activist poster. It could be a pin badge. It could be, so it becomes. It's a sort of. I think he still wanted to control it, to control actually the images. And I think if you look at the sketchbooks, I think he wanted to manage how this activity. I don't think that he wasn't very upset when people began to copy him. I think things like the Tokyo pop shop, these fake Keith Harings. It didn't really upset him. He just thought that means I'm having an effect, So I think he was just quite, he wasn't wanting to, he wasn't issuing writs and things and trying to prevent people from making fake T-shirts. I think he was just like, wow, I'm having an effect in the world, sort of thing. So.
We had another question.
Great exhibition, and for somebody of that generation, the thing that I felt most at the end of it, or remembered, was fear.
Fear, okay.
The macro fear of the bomb and the micro fear of AIDS.
Yeah.
That was very vivid and moving.
Yeah.
And at the end of the exhibition, on that wall, was that sequence of work that he did, where he clearly knew how ill he was becoming.
The drawings.
The drawings.
Yeah.
Could you talk about those? Because they were very different and quite disturbing.
Yeah, he would have been, HIV and AIDS, it's one of the it was personal and political for Keith Haring. It was first reported, the first accounts of AIDS were reported in the New York Times in '81, and it was this gay plague, as he described it, or gay cancer. So nobody really knew what it was. There's great ignorance about this this virus that was cutting through the New York downtown scene, being one of the epicenters, New York and California. So I think Haring, he was diagnosed in 1988, which is the same year as these drawings, I think. But I think it's very clear from some earlier works in that section. There's a work from '85 which clearly is a HIV/AIDS work, but where this is sort of the moment at which there's something happening. His friends all down, Klaus Nomi and Martin Burgoyne, and artists who he was friends with and worked with at Club 57, who were fellow students, were becoming ill at the prime of life, and then just dropping dead. So I think he knew. He was becoming aware of, and he was becoming aware of what HIV was and how it was transmitted, and what caused it. And I think, and so he was, before being diagnosed, I think he knows it's very likely he's going to be HIV positive, which at that point is a death sentence, because I think it was just it's just this thing. So those works are, they're very brave works, those, I think, because they're written about in the journals as being a confrontation. He sort of confronts HIV, and it's almost like a macabre comic strip, and where it's episodic, and it's almost like it's a diabolic work, really. It's sort of it's angry, but it's casting this demon sperm, as he described it, this sort of black sort of sperm with this with horns in this role of sort of cutting through humanity, and it's a confrontation. I think he confronts it in '88, and I think I think around that time the works become very horrific and phantasmagoric. There's a sort of touch of there's kibosh in those big over very elaborate canvas ink paintings. No, but I think it's interesting, because I think even though he knows his time is short, he's still he commits himself to campaigning, to becoming a campaigning activist. So a lot of in '87 was the first time the Reagan administration admits publicly that there's this crisis, and the guidance to prevent AIDS and HIV from being transmitted is to not have sex, and Keith Haring knows in his generation this is just an impossibility. So safe sex is the answer. So I think he's wanting to find positive responses to a catastrophic situation, and the palette of the world. There's still, or the works still have they still communicate as pop messages. There's still activist works. You can see the HIV, when ACT UP founded this very important, still active AIDS, HIV education campaigning organisation. You can see them wearing T-shirts, bearing the Keith Haring pink triangle.
And I think of some documentaries where Ken Sharp mentions that after being diagnosed, he was just impatient to work and complete his social mission, and to be maximum productive.
His images and his campaigning effect was still felt into the 1990s. So I think, and the symbol of ACT UP remains the Keith Haring. It's the kind of pink triangle, this reclaiming this symbol of confidence and power, and so.
Do we have more questions?
More
comments?
You mentioned his journals a few times. Can you tell us a little bit more about those? What kind of work are they? Are they very detailed? Did he draw in them?
It's a diary. It's a journal. I'm not sure. They begin in 1978, so it's a sort of primary source if you want to know about Keith Haring and his life, and it's particularly around the time when he moves from where he moves from Pittsburgh to New York. And what he's thinking about, and his influence. It's a sort of, he's a good writer. I mean, it's very open. You can just see he's like a young guy in his late 20s, in his late teens, falling in love, going club. I mean, it's just very. It's like his work. It's just completely open. It's like his drawings. There's no, and they're really worth reading, and it's very. It's also. I mean, you think of Keith Haring, you think it's like apparently simple, and then you get to 79, and it's like a complete torrent of influences, and it's Umberto Eco and Roland Barthes and semiotics and and performance art and Simone Forti and Keith. It's really it's like a very fast absorbing of very radical art ideas, and you really there's a beat energy, like almost like it's just like this excitement that he feels from moving from Pennsylvania and then landing in New York City, sort of post-punk New York City downtown scene, and being an art student and meeting performance artists and going clubbing and probably taking drugs and things, and completely being like everything. He's just absorbing all these different like influences, and it's great. And then I think the journals they become a bit spotty when he becomes famous, because it's like he's too busy, and so it becomes attentive again towards the end of the 80s, actually, when he's travelling a lot on planes and he's got time, but he's also aware that his time is short. But they're really great. It's a really essential thing. And the drawings are good.
Are they published?
And Penguin, yeah. I think they were, yeah. They're it's essential reading, I think. The Keith Haring journals, and then there's a biography by John Gruen as well, which he wrote. I think he wrote it. It was kind of when he knew his time was short, so it was kind of the first-person accounts. But that's also really kind of great. Yeah.
What impact do you think drugs had on his work?
I think it made him more open to people and social situations, I think. I don't think it was a key. I don't think it wasn't. I don't think it was. I think he was an artist who was very sort of disciplined. He worked hard. So I think I really get the sense that in the early sort of late 1970s, he's in the studio during the day making works, making a lot of drawings. I mean, the sheer number of works you saw in the first show in '82 at Tony Schifrazzi, he was very, very prolific and very driven and very energetic. And then he was having a lot of fun, I think, in the evening. So I think the two things. I think he was interested in clubs, I think, as being a space where you could have art experiences, I think, as well. So, I mean, he was, one of the sections of the show is really about artist-run spaces, and Mud Club and Club 57. And the Club 57 was this, it was a sort of a basement of a Polish church, where Haring and his friends, Anne Magnuson, Klaus Nomi and John Sex, and what they would, and Kenny Scharf, they would organise exhibitions and film screenings and have events of performance art. There'd be live music, DJs, and Keith Haring's first exhibitions, his first kind of solo shows, were really at Club 57. He organised them himself, but he was also organising exhibitions and screenings of his friends' work. So I think he was interested in the idea of you didn't have to go to an art conventional white cube art gallery. You could also encounter drawings and performance art, in a very fun way, in a club, at the Mud Club, at Paradise Garage. There was a big Keith Haring mural for in the mid-1980s, subway drawings, street murals, and in the gallery as well. So the second exhibition at Tony Schifrazzi, the Black Light Room, which we've sort of made for Liverpool, is really, I mean, it's post-punk, fluorescent paintings and sculptures with under UV light with music. But that's what he did in '83. That was
which you have also brought within Tate.
Yeah,
there is this.
Yeah. It's a club. It's like a club environment. But that was Haring's second show at Tony Schifrazzi. That's what it was. It was a nightclub in the basement. Hi.
Hi, if it was reassuring, it was almost reassuring to hear that you got the simple idea that together with Banksy there could be some kind of obvious link between the two of them. I wonder whether that notion of subversion of the art market itself links artists like that. And I picked up very much on what you were saying about the fact that he wasn't really creating anything for the art market initially, and then we talked about
He was,
in response to this young lady about about prints and so on,
Yeah.
but on a much lower scale really than I guess, and whether that subversion is clearly radically different, but I wonder whether you'd like to draw some comparisons in terms of that side of things.
I think he was difficult. I think he was. I think he attempted to subvert it, and I mean I think there was things like the pop shop. So he would make prints for the pop shop, which were affordable, an edition of 200, and then to his horror, he would put them into the shop on Lafayette Street, and then the gallerist would come in and buy the whole lot of them. So he couldn't undercut the art market, you know. So I think that kind of thing happened. I think, and so I think, but also I think he enjoyed the success. I mean, I think it was. You can see some of the drawings where it's clearly, you know, neocon politics and Reaganomics, and there's hype in the market, and so you have dollar signs appearing in a lot of work actually in the 1980s. Warhol was the same as this sort of new liquidity, and it creates the possibility of it raises profile. Money creates possibility, but it also creates greed, creates inequality. It does two things. So he saw it as having a positive effect in terms of, you know, enable him to have more ambition with the scale of his exhibitions, his work, but it also created a downside. And I think there's a sort of, I think you can sense that. I think he's fighting against it, enjoying it, but fighting against it at the same time. You know, and Julie Gruen would say this as well. You know, he enjoyed the success at the same time as wanting to keep a connection. You know, retain a social activism, using his profile and his fame to raise awareness of social issues.
So maybe we have time for one last question, or otherwise we can close the discussion here and give a round of applause to Darren.